NASA 557, contact tower 128.15.
Caution, caution. Manual, fuel, manual, fuel.
I'm John Goglia.
I'm Greg Fife.
And I'm Todd Curtis.
And we are the Flight Safety Detectives.
Between us, we have over a century of aviation accident investigation and safety experience to draw on as we discuss issues that affect all of us.
So we are qualified to share our perspectives on accidents and incidents and what can be learned from them for the future.
We're proud to say that we have two sponsors that really relate to the topic of aviation safety: the Professional Aviation Maintenance Association, or PAMA, and Avemco Insurance. Later on in the show, we'll tell you how you can get a 5% discount on your insurance just for listening to the show.
We don't just dissect the official reports. In every episode, we identify safety issues and take the mystery out of accident investigations.
So maybe pilots and their planes can have safer flights ahead.
Well, hello, Todd.
Hello again.
Here we are for another session of Flight Safety Detectives, and Greg is still all tied up, so it's just you and I again.
Well, that's okay.
And today we have an interesting one that I thought that our audience would enjoy. It involves Boston's Logan Airport, my home airport, used to be your home airport, and it involves use of the English language, aviation's standard language, and the difficulties that one can encounter if you don't have good use of English language. You know, unfortunately, ICAO and all the countries around the world have agreed to use English as the one language, and they teach English to pilots around the world. But many pilots flying in their home countries never get to use English because those countries will talk to them in their native language, except at the big international airports.
And I'd like to add that even if you are a native speaker of English, like myself, if you fly in any airport in America, large or small, the English that's used by air traffic controllers and by pilots, which is clear and concise and very specific, it takes a while to get used to understanding what the specific terms mean, understanding when to use them, and understanding what actions to take once you're given a command by air traffic control. It is difficult enough if you're fluent in English. It's even more difficult if English is your second or third language. And again, this is not conversational English. This is not go to the resort and order a beer English. This is aviation English. And it just takes time to get used to it. And for those international pilots who fly in the States, over time, I'm sure they will get used to it and get much better at it. But as this example that we're talking about today shows, it can be very confusing and potentially hazardous to anyone flying in that vicinity if you're not communicating clearly.
All right, so let's take it. This airplane flew into US, was flying in US airspace, and it was coming into Logan, and the tower tape picks up about 10,000 feet. And at 10,000 feet, they're calling him and asking him to verify his altitude, because obviously it's showing up differently on their screen than the 10,000 feet that they've requested him to be at. And that's the communications gap. So why don't you start it, and we'll talk about the different pieces.
Very
Now,
good.
this
For those of you
should
watching
be
the video
clear.
version of this, we're using excerpts from a YouTube video that apparently had about 11 minutes worth of conversation involving these pilots. And just going through this, as you can see, you have a depiction of the general Boston area. And Boston Logan, you can see, is sort of like in the upper third here. You see a BOS where the airport is. And this aircraft, which has a tail number, which is associated with a executive jet, was registered in Brazil. Presumably, it was a Brazilian flight crew. Not presumably, it sounds like this person was having difficulties communicating with air traffic control. And we'll let you listen to a piece of this just to get an idea of what's going on here.
Papa Sierra, Foxtrot Bravo Lima, roger. Confirm robot 3 arrival, 15 right transition.
Okay, robot 3 arrival, Foxtrot Bravo.
And the 15 right transition, correct, sir?
5 right, Foxtrot Bravo Lima.
Papa Sierra, Foxtrot Bravo Lima, thank you. And you have information Foxtrot, correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. Papa Sierra, Foxtrot Bravo Lima, I'm in the altitude, maintain 10,000. You descended too early.
Okay, descend to early 10,000, Foxtrot Bravo Lima.
Papa Sierra, Foxtrot Bravo Lima, maintain, climb and maintain 10,000.
Okay, maintain 10,000, Fox Bravo Lima.
Papa Sierra, Foxtrot Bravo Lima, fly your present heading, it's vectors ILS 15 right.
Flat 15 right, Foxtrot Bravo Lima, maintain 10,000.
Papa Sierra, Foxtrot Bravo Lima, you're still descending, climb maintain 10,000, stay speed.
Okay, climb 10,000, Foxtrot Bravo Lima.
Papa Sierra, Foxtrot Bravo Lima, stay speed.
Speed 220, sir.
Papa Sierra, Foxtrot Bravo Lima, maintain 250 knots.
Maintain 250 knots, Foxtrot Bravo Lima, maintain 10,000.
And John, you've looked at this more extensively and read up on it before the show started. Tell us the series of things that was going on during this time. And again, we only have 11 minutes of this. This might have been going on for quite a bit longer.
Well, apparently right around 10,000 feet, he's contacting the control tower in Logan instead of the regional up in New Hampshire, and not knowing which direction he came in, and he could have been under the Washington, D.C. center, controlling the airflow coming into Logan. But in any event, wherever he came from, when he gets on the Logan tower, they ask him to confirm his altitude and his speed. And therein lies the first problem that pops up. They ask two things in the same sentence. And repeatedly, this pilot cannot handle two requests in one sentence. He with difficulty responds to the first of the two and ignores the second one. And you can see that if you view the tape that Todd's going to put up, you'll hear that over and over. Now, this air traffic controller was extremely patient with this guy. I mean, he really, really went the extra mile to help this guy understand what was going on. But the air traffic controller was getting frustrated because Logan, like many airports in the US, is very busy. And if you've got an airplane coming in that's not following ATC directions, it causes big problems. Now, what's not said here is, was any traffic diverted? I think some of it was. I think they switched some of it off and should start to hear the conversations in there. But in any event, even if they did or didn't, this guy is causing a problem for the air traffic controller. So the first event, they asked him to state his altitude and his speed. And he came out at 13,000 feet. It took a little bit to get them to identify that. Now at 10,000 feet, they're telling him he's got a hold at 10,000. They're asking him his altitude and his speed. And he gave the altitude, didn't give the speed. They requested it again. And he said the altitude again, did not give the speed. So now they push on it a third time, and they tell him that he's already busted the altitude, which means he's already passed through the altitude, and he's now down into the 8,000 foot range. And he's also going 220 knots, and he's supposed to be going 250. And the air traffic controller went to great lengths to try to extract from him his speed. Now, the air traffic controller can see it, but they're not always accurate on the radar, on the air traffic control radar. There are differences, and especially aircraft that are operated by foreign countries. So that's why he's asking them to confirm his altitude so he can compare it to what he has on his screen. Right, so he struggles along with that. Now, Todd, you've been in this situation with trying to follow these instructions. What were your thoughts when you saw this?
Well, I have sympathy for the person because, again, this is not an easy thing to do under the best of circumstances. And furthermore, we don't even know if there are other extenuating circumstances. Was this at night? Was there weather? Was there other stressors going on in the cockpit? Was this a flight that had flown all the way from Brazil and perhaps there's fatigue involved? And because this was not a accident or a serious incident, we don't have an NTSB report that would give us that kind of information. But whenever you see something like this or hear something like this, you have to go beyond just what you're hearing on the tape. For example, if you go to liveatc.net, which is a great place for getting all kinds of air traffic control tapes, just hearing what's being said is only part of the story. But again, hats off to the air traffic controllers because they clearly had a three-dimensional awareness of what was going on, who was in danger, who had to be diverted, etc. And the fact that this ends up as an interest item that is being written about and posted online gives you an idea of the seriousness of it. And oh, by the way, for those of you watching the video version of this, you see something in the caption that said something like, I have a number for you to call it at TRACON when you get down to the ground. It wasn't a number for them to invite them out to dinner. If you do something in the sky, air traffic control wants to admonish you in some form or fashion. They typically say, hey, contact this number. You might get a tongue lashing. You might get something more formal. It might impact your career or your certifications. But again, if you get to the point where air traffic control is giving you a number to call, that means there's some education that has to be done.
Yes. Or worse than education. I mean, they could tell him he can't leave the country, get somebody else to fly the airplane. I mean, it didn't sound like there was a major disruption to the flight ops around the airport, but definitely there was a disruption. So,
and keep in mind that this can happen to an experienced pilot because if you're flying in, for example, you're flying into an unfamiliar airport, you have to take the time to sit down and do your homework. What are the communications frequencies that I'm expected to get or to use at certain points in the journey? Which frequency should I contact? Depending on what kind of flight you're doing, whether it's a VFR or IFR, or whether you're flying in at a certain altitudes. And every airport tends to have its quirks and differences because of the way that traffic is typically routed in and around that airport, the amount of traffic that's in and around that airport, and the mix of traffic in and around that airport. Now, Boston Logan, you would think, well, this is a major international airport. You're only going to have large jets coming and going. Well, no, not the case. In fact, the tail number of this particular aircraft, where the crew had a communications issue, was a small executive jet. And there are many of those flying into Boston Logan all the time. There are even general aviation aircraft that might be flying in there with fairly low-time pilots in the cockpit. So you can't make assumptions about the airport you're flying into, especially a big airport where you could have a large mix of things happening.
Well, as you were talking, I was thinking if this event had occurred at Atlanta or Chicago, the air traffic controller certainly would not have been as calm as this guy was. Right. The air traffic controller in Chicago would have been screaming at him.
And it's a stressful situation in the cockpit under the best of circumstances. I can only imagine how much more stress it was that was happening there when the flight crew, and again, we're assuming it was a flight crew, but this was an executive jet. It could have been a single pilot operation for all we know. And again, for you single pilot operators out there, especially those who are flying single pilot IFR, you have a lot on your plate at any given time. And you have to be prepared to fly the airplane, navigate the airplane, communicate with air traffic control, deal with last second changes, including runway changes, frequency changes. And if you're not prepared, you should sit down and have a conversation with yourself. Should I fly today or should I fly into this airport? or should I not do any kind of flying at all and go get some additional training before I attempt to fly into a more complex airspace?
You know, and what's amazing here is we have several additional airports around Boston, but there's one that really is a general aviation and corporate operation, and it's much less active, and it's only 20 miles away. So I have to wonder why they chose to come into Logan and with a such a small airplane when they could go into Bedford, Hanscom Field, and have the run of the place, really.
And I've
They
flown in and
almost-
out of Hanscom. Haven't flown in and out of Logan, and I have flown in and out of other small airports in the area. There are options in Bedford. Hanscom Air Force Bases, where Bedford, Mass is, and where this airport is, has a lot of facilities, long runways, and there are executive jet operations. Large corporations and small corporations, and fractional jet operations that fly in and out of there all the time. So they're a fully capable airport for this kind of aircraft that was apparently involved in this air traffic control situation.
Yes, well, fortunately, it worked out without incident. Well, I shouldn't say it that way. Without a serious problem. Thankful for the air traffic controller that kept control of this all the way to the ground. You know, and I'm sure the pilot had great intentions, but he had difficulties communicating, which is a problem. So, and I suspect you're right. I suspect he probably was a single pilot in there, because here the Phenom 300 is not a very big airplane. So even though there are two positions for pilots in there, I suspect that he was all alone. So we will continue to follow that to see just what was uncovered, because there might be something in there that would be good teaching moment for everybody, all our pilots that listen to it. So we will endeavor to get the rest of the story, as Greg likes to say.
And this particular event was fairly recent. In early August 2024, August 9th, as a matter of fact, there was another event involving a Brazilian registered aircraft. Unfortunately, this was a fatal one that involved the crash of an airliner. And those of you who've, even if you weren't following this sort of thing on the news, this was all over the news because there are several witnesses who took videos of the last portion of this aircraft's flight. And for those of you who are watching our video, you can see that this aircraft appears to be in a flat spin before it disappears behind a line of trees, and unfortunately all perished on board the flight. This is still in the very earliest stages of the investigation. It involved a Voepass Airlines ATR 72, and the information is still in bits and pieces. The Brazilian version of the NTSB, called SANIPA, I believe, is running the investigation. They have just started doing that. They have the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder, but they have not released any data or transcripts from that yet. They haven't released radar tracks of this aircraft, but thanks to sites like FlightAware and Flight Radar 24, we have fairly good data from the ATSB track of the aircraft. It had flown in from the west toward Sao Paulo, was cruising at 17,000 feet, and about 40, 50 miles northwest of Sao Paulo, it went from a normal, nice and level flight, flying fairly straight, to rapidly losing altitude. At one point indicating on Flight Radar 24 it was losing like 12,000 feet a minute. And within about 2 minutes, it went from a normal flight path to crashing on the ground, killing everyone on board. And this was an aircraft that famously was involved in an icing event that you, John, worked on directly in 1994, 30 years ago, involving another ATR 72. And this time there were reports of icing in the area, but it's unclear from the reports I've seen whether or not the icing was along the route of flight of this aircraft. And definitely unsure and unaware whether or not the flight crew was aware of the icing situation and if they had taken any precautions for that. That will come out in time. But the one thing we can talk about here is what we've seen in the video of the last moments of flight. This aircraft was in a spin, and not just a regular spin, but a flat spin. That's even more difficult to get out of. And John, this is where you can give us your insights into what you've seen on the board. How likely is it that a large transport aircraft, either turboprop or turbojet, how likely is it that if an aircraft of that type, large transport category aircraft, gets into a spin or a flat spin, how likely is it that they will recover from that spin?
Unless that flight crew is very, very well practiced in install and spin recovery, which is not trained very much, it is going to be a problem. So the airlines worldwide, manufacturers worldwide, want their pilots to be aware of the problem and to avoid it. The best defense against a flat spin or any kind of a spin or a stall is to avoid it in the first place. Don't fly close to the envelope. Don't get yourself in that kind of trouble. Based upon, the flight route that this airplane had and the altitude, it does lend itself to the assumption, and we're assuming here that it was ice. And it is very similar event to the ATR crash that we had in Roselawn, Illinois, when I was on the board. And in that case, he was in holding in icing conditions. They've been holding for a while, so complacency set in. And the airplane, certified for operating in icing conditions, was not certified to operate in this particular type of icing situation. And we at the board struggled with that for a while until we finally got an airplane, an ATR, and we flew it behind a U.S. Air Force tanker that was spraying water droplets. And we were able to see the ice build up in the airplane. We could see that it actually, on the leading edge of every airplane, jet airplane, even piston-powered airplanes, there's a boot, a rubber bladder that's on the leading edge. It's black, it's pretty plain to see, and it inflates like an inner tube. What we discovered in our testing was that under certain conditions, the ice can build up behind that boot on the wing. And because this wing is high aspect ratio, which means it's a very efficient wing, it's a critical wing, and any ice buildup is going to have a very negative effect very quickly. And what we had in Roseland, what we demonstrated with the work that was done, was that ice that built up behind the boot, where you could have the crew can do nothing about it, disrupted the airflow over the flight controls. Now, one of the things that happened in here in the States that's probably on this airplane as well is they were flying with the autopilot on. So if you're flying with the autopilot on and you're not paying attention to the position of your flight controls, which means the control column, right, in the rudder pedals, but mainly the control column, if you're not paying attention that the autopilot is putting in correction for the stall, you're gonna wake up when the airplane's in trouble, because the autopilot's going to kick off. Autopilot's going to try to correct the problems that you're having with the wing, the lift, until it can no longer have the authority to do that. And then it'll trip off in a flash, and all of a sudden, if the pilot has not been paying attention, he's got to try to figure out what's going on with an airplane that's out of control. And most pilots are people, pilots are people. Most of us would take some seconds or longer to figure out what's going on. And then during that critical time, you're just getting deeper and deeper into an event that's almost impossible to recover from.
And the circumstances around this that might have made that even less likely to recover. What was the visibility? Were they able to see the horizon in any way, shape, or form? Were these pilots fatigued? Or is there something about this particular aircraft that had pre-existing conditions that made it less likely to recover? This is things that will come out in time. But in general, and this applies for every airplane out there, whatever aircraft you're flying, it has certain capabilities to deal with ice. you're flying a Cessna 172 like myself, it has no anti-icing equipment. It has no de-icing equipment. Anti-icing equipment, and correct me if I'm wrong, John, is something that you will activate that will prevent ice from forming. De-icing is equipment and technology that takes the ice away from the aircraft once it starts forming. The aircraft I fly has nothing. So if we're flying in conditions we're even close to getting into icing conditions, I start looking at the outside air temperature. I start looking at what I can on the structure, especially the strut, to see if there's even the beginnings of anything forming. And even before that, I make plans to avoid the icing condition I'm in. If it's before I take off, I don't take off. If it's in flight, I find a route that doesn't take me through icing. If I can't do that, well, I do the next best thing, which is avoid it as best as I can and land as soon as practicable. It's not an emergency situation yet, but if you have ice building up and you have no way of getting that ice off your airplane, which is my case, it can turn from a non-normal to an emergency situation pretty darn quick.
Yeah, some people don't realize how quick that can turn. And, and here we go again with an airline, with an autopilot, with a controlled flight plan, a pathway in the sky, right? All the things to make the task easier can also make it susceptible to something bad coming out of it. If the flight crew has gotten complacent, not paying attention to what's going on, distracted, like you said, other event that's taken their attention away from flying the airplane, and then all of a sudden the airplane does something they don't expect, it's going to take them a few seconds or more to figure out what that is, and it may be too late by then. It's not easy to get out of a flat spin. Not easy at all.
And I'm stretching the level of my knowledge of aerodynamics. In a stall, what you have is there is lift not being stalls on the wings, let's say. Lift is not being generated on that wing. In a spin, you have both wings not having lift being generated, but you might have less lift on one than the other. If you have less lift, you have more drag, and that's the direction where the aircraft might start to turn. And you might say to yourself, well, they got engines. Can't they just gun the engines and get out of this? Apparently not. It depends on the aircraft. In most cases, once you get into something like this, it's a question of, do I catch it early enough where I can get out of this before it gets out of control? And out of control could be, you have to have altitude, for sure. And more altitude than you can imagine. You might think, oh, I'm only doing a couple of rotations in this spin I have in a Cessna. I'm not going to drop that much. Yes, you will. And if you're an expert, test pilot, instructor pilot who does this all the time, yes, you can get out of it fairly quickly. But if you're a normal pilot, that is above average even skills, but not above average experience in dealing with this, you come across an unusual situation. I don't care what it is. You might have read about it, you might have heard about it, you might have trained for it, you might have passed a test in it. When it actually happens to you in real life, there's going to be a bit of a delay. One of them being, the delay of denial. It's like, can this actually be happening to me? Then there's a delay of figuring out what's happening. Okay, do I have an idea of what's going on? Then there's a delay of what actions do I take and how quickly do I take them? And in most cases, fortunately, those delays aren't fatal. But in some cases, it could be. Especially if you haven't taken the time to do your basic research into the flight you're taking, haven't taken the time to do the basic training or the basic recurrent training if need be, and haven't taken the time to self-educate. That is, brush up on it every once in a while. Sure, you pass the test whenever you pass the test. Sure, you've been flying for thousands of hours, but we on this podcast have shows after show after show where folks with 3, 4, 5, 10, 15,000 hours, sometimes in the same aircraft model, get themselves in a situation. So don't think you're too smart for the sky. You're not.
When I can remember when I learned to fly, the instructor, most of my training up to my solo was with the same individual. I had a couple other people in there, but most of it was the same individual. And every single time we went flying, before we landed, I had to do a stall and a spin and recover. And at that time, it didn't register why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? You know, so I'd have to do it over and over and over. And they kept making it more challenging. You know, we had to climb the altitude. So we had to get up to some altitude before we would do it. A lot of emphasis on recognizing when you're getting into a stall, because the airplane will actually tell you, if you're familiar with the airplane will give you physical cues. You'll feel it in the butt. You'll feel it in the yoke. In my case, the stick. Right. So you'll have some indications that things are not going well. So he always wanted me to call out the feelings that I had, so that I would be, you know, in my mind attuned that we were approaching a stall in a spin. And I remember my panic when the first time we got into a spin, and but taught me to be calm, taught me to make the right moves to get out of it, and to be aggressive and do it immediately. Don't hesitate. So, but that was then. Today we don't teach that in our basic flying.
That is not taught as part of the curriculum of, let's say, getting a private license or even a commercial certificate. Certain kinds of maneuvers, certain kinds of spirals, stalls, spins, etc., are not part of the curriculum. Now, does that mean you're not trained in it? Sure, you're trained in it, but you're not experiencing it. It's sort of like being told how not to skid your car on an icy road. Well, it's great to get all the information before you start driving, but once the skid starts happening, how are you going to react? And, fortunately, in my case, I've had a few, slippery incidents on the ice, unexpected. And after a couple of them, it's like, okay, I was not as freaked out by them. Next time it happened, well, first of all, it happened less likely because I was more careful. When it did happen, I took corrective action as soon as I felt it sliding. You don't have that luxury in an airplane. Even if you have a full motion simulator, it's not the same thing as the real thing.
How true. How true. Well, that's good. This is going to be another one, and we're going to follow this accident to see what it is, because that is so important, the icing. Not so much for the GA airplanes like the ones you fly, because you're not certified to operate in icing conditions. So really is you got to pay attention. And if there is any ice buildup, you get out of there. Change your altitude, get out and change your direction to get away from whatever it is that's causing the ice to build up. And like you said, if that's not possible, put it on the ground first available. And but for business aircraft that don't have a hot wing, and we should probably talk about that. There's two types of de-icing systems on airplanes. Many of the jet-powered airplanes have a hot wing, which means they take engine air from the engines, it's very hot, duct it through the airplane and out to the wings. So the leading edge of the wing where the ice builds up, it gets to be quite hot in flight. Even though the outside temperature can be down to minus 60 and sometimes more. The wing is hot from the inside, so ice will not adhere to it. On other airplanes, mainly turboprop airplanes, there's a boot on the leading edge of the airplane, and that's that black band that I talked about in the very beginning. It's a rubber boot. It's like an inner tube on a tire. And there's an air compressor on the airplane. And when you start to get build up, you select the anti-ice, and it pumps this boot up and then deflates it, and pumps it up and then deflates it. And it breaks the ice off. Well, if you're not careful and not paying attention, the ice can build up behind the boot. And that's another area where the pilots have to pay attention to what's going on. It's not turn it on and forget about the problem. It's turn it on and start monitoring it very, very closely. Because if it is still building up, you got to find a place to put the airplane down or get out of the icing conditions. Might be as simple as going low or not likely to go up, but it might be to go up. Might be a band of clouds that goes up to like 15,000 feet, and you can go up to 20 and get out of it. But you got to do something and not hang around in it, because if you hang around in it, the outcome might not be very good.
And this segues into the second to last word. If you have a situation where you're flying and there's any chance of icing, take the extra time to look through the forecast. You have icing forecasts, you have PIREPs you can look at. You can see if there, for example, a pilot report of an aircraft like yours, flying at an altitude like what you're going to fly in, flying in an area you're about to fly through. If they have an icing report from that kind of aircraft, you should especially pay attention to it, because if they're reporting it, that's probably something of interest to that pilot. If you're flying that same kind of airplane, it should be of interest to you. As for stalls and spins, again, you don't have the luxury of having this taught on a regular basis, nor do you have high fidelity simulators that can give you the real thing. That said, take some time to look it up, to look up and see what are the characteristics. Look up in your pilot operating handbook, look up what are the speeds where stalls start to become likely. Recall or review the kinds of conditions that contaminate the wing that make it more likely that you lose lift at certain airspeeds. And again, a contaminated wing could be dirt, it could be bugs on the leading edge, it could be ice. That affects your stall characteristics. So, you're not going to remember everything all the time. But now that you've seen the show, go out and do a little research.
Yeah, pay attention. Too many people think, oh, we're up at altitude, now I can relax. Well, yes, you can back off a little bit, but you got to stay in the game. You got to keep your head on what's going on. You can't be sitting. The expression is flying the airplane from the last row of seats. No, you can't. You got to be up front and you got to be paying attention. You may be able to slack off a little bit, but just a little. You got to stay on top of your game. And to say that, the game starts before you even get off the ground. Pre-planning at home. You're going to fly it. Make sure you look at very, very closely at the weather between where you're leaving from and where you're going to. And all too often after events, while I was at the NTSB, this would come up all too frequently, was guy would check the weather where he is, check the weather where he's going, and pay very little attention to what was in the middle. And sometimes we would have incidents and they would admit that it looked pretty good. I didn't dig into it, what the weather was like. Yeah, well, that's not the way to be flying. You need to be in your planning stage. You need to be really focused on what's going on between here and there and everything in between. And then, as I say over and over and over on these airplanes, because I say it because we still see these problems, right? Pre-flights. I just found another one, in fact, I didn't even read it all yet, but I just found another one where an airplane crashed because of a lousy pre-flight. If you're a pilot and you don't fully understand the pre-flight, find a mechanic that works on the airplane and do it. Mechanics, when they do walk-arounds in the airplanes, their eyes are always moving. They're always looking, and that's what you've got to be doing. And we're going to do some things on owner maintenance pretty soon. I've been amassing a bunch of accidents on those. Simple things, but they're problems that pilots didn't recognize what they were doing. But in any event, you want to do a good session of pre-planning. You want to make sure you check the weather. You want to do a very thorough pre-flight. And remember, touch your airplane. I'm talking about general aviation mostly here. Some commercial, some business aviation. Touch your airplane. Wiggle your flight controls. It helps you focus. It helps you focus on what you're looking for. Right? And then same thing inside the cockpit when you get in. Make sure you do a thorough check in the cockpit. And I have said many times before, I've seen all too many, mainly corporate pilots, do a pretty rushed job on the cockpit. Mainly when questioned, I don't question them, but I sort of have a talk to them later and say, what do you do with your pre-flight? And some of them will admit, well, we brought the airplane in, we don't check everything. Or I checked it in the hangar. I don't do it again when the airplane's sitting out in the ramp. That's the wrong answer. But in any event, You have to do a very thorough cockpit check. And then when you get in the air, put that head on a swivel, because there's an awful lot of young novice pilots out there building time and experience in and around these airports, and you need to pay attention. You don't want to be involved in their accident. Right? So pay attention to what's going on around you. Just all these little indications of being a pilot requires a lot more focus and attention to detail than driving a car. So please, please fly safely.
Thank you for checking out our show. We really value our listeners and subscribers. Our podcast gets ranked by you and how much you like it. So please give us 5 stars in your podcast platform.
We want to keep in contact with you. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and of course, YouTube.
You can email the show at flightsafetydetectives@gmail.com. By the way, if you're on YouTube, we're really working on growing the channel, and it helps if you all send in comments. Please do that, and we read all the comments.
And be sure to subscribe. Remember, if you're in the market for aviation insurance, you can save 5% with Avemco just by mentioning our show. Visit them at www.avemco.com. That's it for this episode of the Flight Safety Detective. Until the next episode, fly safe.